Today's special US engagement mission episode of Socially Democratic is presented to you by Dunn Street. Dunn Street is a modern campaign agency dedicated to using data-driven grassroots organising to build winning campaigns and make the world a better place. Whether you're in business, issue-based campaigns, or an organisation driving change in your community, Dunn Street develops strategies to overcome challenges by connecting people that share the same values and organises them to achieve common goals from the ground up. To find out how Dunn Street can partner with you and your organisation or your business, hit us up at dunnstreet.com.au. Welcome to episode 20 of Socially Democratic. My name is Stephen Donnelly, and this is your favourite weekly centre-left political and cultural podcast that will dive into the progressive issues of the day and the people leading them from both home and abroad. And abroad we will remain. Today's episode is recorded in conjunction with the Dunn Street United States Engagement Mission, which is a program that connects leading Australian social democrats with leaders in the policy, government, advocacy and tech space here in the United States. In particular focusing on Washington, DC and New York City. And if you're interested in joining the 2020 mission to the United States, you should hit us up at dunnstreet.com.au or on our various socials, including Dunn Street's LinkedIn page. On today's episode, I spoke with fellow Aussie and card-carrying member of the Australian Labor Party, Ryan Hamilton. Ryan is now the Chief of Staff for the Environmental Defence Fund, which is the leading bipartisan environmental organisation that seeks market-based solutions using sound science, economics and the law. And I spoke to Ryan in their New York offices to discuss his pathway from Labor politics back home in Australia to working with the Environmental Defence Fund, and some of the amazing work that the EDF are doing to tackle climate change. So I hope you enjoy today's podcast. And don't forget, the podcast is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and all your favourite podcast apps. So if you are on Apple Podcasts, don't forget to leave us a rating and a review to help us boost our numbers on the internet. And don't forget to follow Dunn Street on all of our socials, including Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Let's get to today's episode. Okay, we're taping this one on a Tuesday in the Union Square area of Manhattan, New York, and we're joined on the podcast today with the Novocastrian, living in New York now, the Chief of Staff for the Environmental Defence Fund, Ryan Hamilton. Welcome to Socially Democratic.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
I didn't think I was going to get here today because, one, it started snowing in the morning, and being an Australian, when do we see snow? And so I started freaking out about that. And then I was in Midtown, which was a mistake in the first place, and the president...
Oh, you walked into that particular...
I got stuck literally on a block and I couldn't get off the block. You must have been coming from Trump Tower or something, or going somewhere else, but there was police blockades everywhere for his motorcade and I was stuck there for 45 minutes.
Well, there's two things you figure out pretty quickly as an Aussie in the big smoke in New York. One is that the snow doesn't go away. It's terrifying the first time you walk outside and there's ice falling out of the sky. But the second is whenever there's a president of either political persuasion, it doesn't matter Republican or Democrat in town, the whole city just turns into a nightmare. 4 or 5 blocks around him, they've got motorcade blockages and everything. So you're trying to avoid that like the plague.
He got a reasonably okay reception, I think mostly because the people in that area were all just tourists, gawking at the... there was like 40 cars that went past in the motorcade. That in itself was quite impressive, but seeing his sort of big bonce of a head through the beast was kind of weird.
You'd also have to be a pretty committed protester to go out there in what is about 4 or 5 degrees, I think, at the moment. That's probably being generous. So you'd have to be really opposed to whatever it is he was saying today to get out and wave a placard around.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there was only a couple of boos. But here we are in quite an impressive skyline you got here, Ryan. You've done well.
Yeah, it's certainly a long way from the dungeons of Parliament House that my former office was in. They've given me a couple of windows here and let me look out at the New York skyline. So,
talk us through the journey that led you to be working at one of the most influential environmental organisations in the United States, if not the world. Yeah,
well, it was a long and winding road. I don't think too many in my family would have imagined when I was growing up in the suburbs of Maitland outside of Newcastle that I'd end up here in New York, let alone at an environmental NGO of the size that the Environmental Defence Fund is. my family background is blue collar workers in Newcastle. Uncles and grandparents that have had something to do with the coal and the steel industry through multi generations. So to land here is not an easy jump and not something that would have been foreseen. But to be honest, it came about after a long career back in Australian politics. I'd worked for all sorts of people on the Labor side at both state and federal level. I'd worked for Simon Crean for a while, then Jason Clare, and then I got involved in the 2016 campaign running the comms unit in CHQ. After that, I was a little bit burnt out and a little bit jaded by the ability for Australian politics to kind of deliver on some of the things that I cared about. So I applied for something called the Green Card Lottery and managed to jag myself a green card and a one-way ticket to New York.
First attempt?
First attempt, didn't even know what it was.
Lucky bastard.
In fact, one of my buddies in CHQ at the time, Jules Sidebottom, had told me that he'd been applying for about half a dozen years. And I was sitting there in the depths of the 2016 campaign and logged on to check it, and he was standing close by and said, "That means you've gotten it." And I said, "Oh, geez, is it hard?" He wasn't a particularly happy chap when I told him that it was my first time.
That is remarkable. It literally is a lottery. Like it's... as you said, so many people have applied and so many people have not got it. You got it first chance.
Yeah, they say it's about 4% of a chance for an Aussie.
Do you find that your life is just a boulevard of green lights at the moment? Or
Well, personally perhaps, but professionally we're running into a few roadblocks on climate and all sorts of other things. So maybe I'm using my luck up in the wrong realms.
What if the Ryan Hamilton of 10 years ago was to meet your Ryan Hamilton today? Would he have ever thought that, one, you'd be working in New York, but two, also working for an environmentalist NGO?
Probably not. It's been a long and winding journey. But I tell you what, there is something when I was thinking about this as you were saying that question. 10 years ago was around the time that the CPRS first got the kibosh in the Australian Parliament. I wasn't working directly on that policy set, but I was working for the Rudd and then Gillard governments of that time, and it was a public policy failure of epic proportions in my mind what the Parliament did to that bill. We were among the world leaders at preparing for what to do about climate. We'd had put together a package, ably led by Penny Wong and Greg Combay, putting together an incredible piece of legislation. It wasn't 100%. It wasn't perfect.
Nothing ever is in politics.
Nothing ever is. But again, it was a really good first step towards global leadership on climate, and similarly brought along a lot of the industry evolutions that we needed to make sure happened to cushion the blow for some of those trade-exposed industries. And we saw, what I still say is one of the worst political deals in history between the Conservative parties and the Greens party, who, both have to take responsibility for the current predicament of Australian climate politics, because that was just short-sighted political failure. So to answer your question, no, I probably wouldn't have imagined I was here, but I can trace some of my motivation for being here back to the failure of that bill to survive.
Talk to us a bit about the Environmental Defence Fund. You were kind enough to present a session for the Dunn Street engagement mission that finished up last week. And you kindly showed us a video which could easily summarise what the Environmental Defence Fund has done over the past 100 years. Is that right?
Not quite, about 55.
I'm over the till a bit there. It was the ACLU that's been around for 100 years. Yes. That's right. So over 55 years. But this is a audio medium, and unfortunately, you can't show that video to all of our listeners at home. So you're going to have to talk about it now.
You've seen through me. No, so it's about 55, 56 years ago. A few scientists in Long Island actually said about what they, I'm sure this is at least a PG, perhaps an MA level podcast, so I can use our original slogan, which was keep the bastards honest, or sue the bastards, So back then, they were a collection of scientists and lawyers that were really looking for ways to hold industry's feet to the fire on areas of environmental policy that they saw as detracting from the natural environment. That played itself out in the case of something called DDT, a chemical that was being used in all sorts of industrial products back then, but was being shown to have a negative impact on flora and fauna and wildlife around that part of Long Island and subsequently across the country and the world. And that really set up a model for environmental progress that was based on legal challenge and then evolved over the years into second and third tiers of environmental progress that we called, the second one largely being around conservation and buying up big tracts of land in order to protect it, and then the one that's probably most synonymous with EDF these days, which is the third wave of market-based reform, which was really about, in the 80s and 90s, building markets around pollution and evolving into emissions trading schemes and carbon schemes of the 20th century. So we've had a hand in each of those major waves of evolution, as we will looking towards the fourth wave, which is usually about using technology to deliver those same impacts.
It's a massive organisation. Just give us a sense of the scale that the EDF has in terms of its reach, both here in the United States and globally.
Yeah, it is, and the trajectory is only going in one direction. We've got about 800 staff now, which is, if you look at the year-on-year growth over the last 5 or 10 years, it's just kept going up and up and up, which has forced us to make sure that we've got a professional infrastructure that can handle that kind of growth, because our tagline now has evolved from "Sue the Bastards" into "Finding the Ways That Work." We are very much a centrist, bipartisan organisation that is utterly focused on finding solutions to those big challenges that we face as an environment. And what that means is that we have to be able to harness the resources that are at our disposal and use them efficiently, because we don't have an infinite supply, but we do have a lot of really smart people working in this building in New York, but also in London, in our office over there, and in Beijing, in Japan, the Philippines, as well as all over the United States. So it is a big organisation with far-reaching consequences from our work.
You mentioned harnessing resources. Talk to us a bit about what that looks like.
It's really, so we've got a bunch of different streams. It's about finding the places that we can add the most value. We don't work on everything. We work on the things that we know we can be good at. So that can play out in any number of our areas of work, whether it's our ecosystems work, working with the agricultural sector in California, for example, to build out climate resilience and accepting that there's a certain proportion of emissions that are in the atmosphere that we can't do anything about, and really working with those stakeholders to make sure that the building of that infrastructure is resilient. It could be our oceans work, where we've been working with fisheries all over the world to implement a market-based model called catch shares, which is really working about making sure that we have a sustainable food supply for those regions and a sustainable fishery system. Or most acutely, it could be the political affairs work that we're doing here and trying to lay the groundwork for a potential US climate bill, whether that is in 2021, if there is a change of administration, or if it's a little bit further off in the distance. But we make sure that we're using the resources we have at our disposal for the best possible value.
And what kind of mix of people do you have working here? I mean, you've talked about you've got scientists here. I mean, who is the brains trust of this organisation?
I think the brains trust is best described at that nexus between scientists, economists, and still, quite a few lawyers who work in this place. We haven't sacrificed the original mantle of the organisation of making sure that we're holding the feet to the fire through the legal system. We have an incredibly capable general counsel in a woman named Vicky Patton, who is involved in any number of suits at any particular point in time, and making sure that where industry does overstep the mark, that we're there to hold them to account. Or when politicians do the same. We've got any number of cases in the Supreme Court and in high state courts at the moment trying to address the various rollbacks of the Trump administration. But we also are deploying the expertise of scientists and economists to make sure that the things we're working on are scientifically rigorous. That is absolutely vital to the work we do. But similarly, how do we utilise the tools of market economics to make sure that we're optimising in all sorts of different ways? So,
what impresses me the most is it's like an orchestra. The EDF. There's so many different important moving parts that make the piece work so well. I think I can't think of any organisation in Australia that does couple a legal strategy, a scientific strategy, a campaign strategy, a political strategy, and a general comms, I guess, as well as what you would add into that. But it's amazing that, and you're obviously the chief of staff, trying to pull all of that together. That must be challenging.
It is challenging, and there's lots of different parts to this organisation. I think there is a lot of similarities between the work that I was doing in politics and the work that I'm doing here, in the sense that when you're at the fulcrum of any political organisation, as you'd know, or any campaign in particular, there's all sorts of different moving parts that you need to make sure you've got your eye on. You're never necessarily the expert in that area, but you need to make sure that you're asking the right questions and you're overseeing the experts in the right way. I think most that know me know that I've never purported to be an expert in social media strategy or anything digital. I struggle to get my phone to turn on and off, but I do know that that is a really important part of modern campaigning. And when I was working in that space, we had really good people around us making sure that we were optimising our digital strategy in 2016, for example. It's the same here. I'm not a climate scientist. I don't have a PhD from Yale in economics like our head of climate does. But I do know that it's important to utilise those resources and to put them to the best possible use. So that's where my value add comes in.
And that would take a lot of financial support to make this operation move in the right direction. Just talk to us about the scale of how you pull together financial support to make the EDF work.
It does. It certainly does. And one of the most acute differences between progressive not-for-profits in the United States and Australia is the culture of philanthropy that exists in the United States. We couldn't do what we do here without the incredibly generous support of a number of large and small philanthropists. We have a number of those that are intimately involved in our organisation, whether they sit on the board, whether they're engaged in the policy discussions that we're leading, whether they're community leaders themselves. But it is the financial support that allows us to continue to do the work we do and make sure that we've got the best and brightest in here doing that work. So that was something that I had to get my head around coming over from Australia, where, as you know, the culture of philanthropy isn't well developed.
Why do you think that is? Because you've been on both sides of the Pacific now, and after the session we had with you last week, we're in the subway, we had a bit of a discussion about that, and we couldn't sort of get our heads around it.
I think there's a lot of different reasons for it. Australians have tended to rely for a very long time on government and, more acutely politicians to solve a lot of these social ills that they identify. And as such, we've produced an environment where if it's not business, then it's government, and if it's not government, then it's business in the eyes of a lot of consumers and or voters. So the role of private philanthropy hasn't really found its way through that niche. If there is a market failure, then a lot of people have just looked to government to solve that problem. That's not an unjustifiable view in a country like Australia, where we have produced such an effective social safety net, where we have such amazing healthcare systems like Medicare, where we have, a relatively effective, if not perfect, public education system, where we've managed to grow universities that are among the best in the world without large private philanthropic contributions, although there's a few of those creeping into the higher education sector now, I noticed.
Yeah.
So really the need hasn't been as acute in Australia as it is in the United States, where the state just has dropped the ball in a number of different ways, and people have looked to those of means to fund institutions that can drive that social change in a different way. And it's just become an expected norm.
You mentioned before that the organisation is a non-partisan organisation, and that's obviously been the case since it was first set up.
Since our inception, yeah.
Yep. How do you manage trying to straddle that bipartisan position when you have a current administration in the White House that openly rejects the notion that our climate is changing and it is because of human behaviour?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and in a lot of ways this is a question that a lot of NGOs in the United States have been confronting over the last couple of years. We are not in normal times. Donald Trump is not a normal president. He's not a normal Republican. And a lot of organisations have had to grapple with what that means for bipartisan or non-partisan positions, and we're no exception to that rule. We have been fighting the Trump administration in the courts, through the media, through our political affairs operation. We've been pushing back against a destructive desire to pull back environmental regulation in all sorts of different ways. whether that's the clean car standards, whether that's the regulations around methane emissions. There's all sorts of different examples. What we've chosen to do in terms of maintaining that bipartisan part of our organisation, which is very important to our identity and our practical ability to deliver the things that we say we will deliver, is that we're focusing on those areas of the Republican Party where we do have allies. And as much as they might not get the traction that the Trump Republicans get, they do exist. We've supported candidates in congressional races, Republican candidates, that align with our vision and align with our goals. There was unfortunately a candidate that lost, but a really close ally of EDF down in Florida, Carlos Cabello, who was one of the first to introduce a Republican climate bill. There's still a couple of folks like that in the Congress, and there'll be more. The political tide does turn all sorts of different directions in this country, and anyone that I think imagines that Trump's hold on the Republican Party is absolute and irreversible, I think is a tad naive about what it takes to hold one side of politics in your ideology. There are good people still in the Republican Party, as there are in the Democratic Party here, that have a determination to make sure we right the ship and get some of these issues back onto the forefront of our minds.
Will the fund play a role in the 2020 presidential election?
So we will. We'll play a role in 2020 elections up and down the ballot. I have long been an observer and admirer of American politics, perhaps coming from the fact that I've been obsessed with all sorts of politics since I was a kid, sitting there watching Anthony Green report on random marginal electorates while I was sitting on my couch in Maitland. It's probably the numbers that got me in before it was the value set. So, the different political systems have long fascinated me. Yeah. And over here, it's political junkie land. You can literally follow an election any day of the week in any part of the world, any part of the country. So I'm looking forward to what will be my first election season in this role, watching EDF's ability to help candidates up and down the ballot. So the presidential will inevitably get a lot of attention. We're somewhere between 15 and 20, depending on the day of the week, Democratic challenges for their nomination. But there's a lot of really interesting ballots in congressional districts, Senate districts, state legislatures that we'll be really focusing on in 2020.
And what does that help look like? How does that manifest in a campaign? How does the Environmental Defence Fund go and support candidates?
So there's a bunch of different ways. The most acute role for the Environmental Defence Action Fund, which is our 501c4, led capably by a guy named Joe Bonfiglio.
Just park that from
501c4 is going to need some explanation.
Explain that to folks.
So it is the political affairs, or it's the active lobbying arm of any charity. You've got very clear guidelines around what a charitable organisation or an NGO can do under the tax code to make sure that they retain that status. And very specifically, there's a series of political activities that you can't do. And a lot of organisations, us included, set up a separate arm where they raise money separately. Their staff are hived off in a different part of the organisation, and they are acutely focused on influencing political races. Mm-hmm. So a lot of your listeners, I'm sure, would be really interested in that part of our operation, which is, it's a really professional shop.
What do you think about... Actually, no, before we go into politics... let's stick with politics for the moment. So I do want to ask about some of the things that the fund are doing in other areas. Sure. The Green New Deal did get a lot of media when it was first launched or announced. What's been the response within the sort of the centrist environmental movement on that? I think
the Green New Deal and Senator Ed Markey up in Massachusetts and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez here in New York and a number of the other co-sponsors, they did a great service to climate action and environmental causes by raising that consciousness to another level in this country. It has been an area of political consciousness through multiple cycles, but what the Green New Deal and those representatives did is they raised it to a whole new level. They got people engaged in a way that was accessible and understandable. Do I agree with everything in the Green New Deal? I don't. But do I think it has allowed a whole separate group of people who were perhaps not accessible to the environmental community to start talking about these issues. Absolutely. In particular, I think what the Green New Deal has done is it's meant that the democratic side of politics here is acutely focused on the need for climate action and the need to set it as a priority for a first-term incoming administration. So there's been some polling data that shows that climate has become a number one causal voting issue in a number of the early primary states, which is, as much as it's been important for a long time, it's struggled to overcome healthcare and education and the economy and those types of bread and butter issues to capture attention. I think a large amount of credit for that success can go to the Green New Deal.
And my follow-up question to that is then I'd like to get a sense from you about the perception that voters in the United States have towards the environment and climate change and the issues of climate. Is it perceived as being, if you're an independent voter in a battleground state, would you perceive the environment as a left-wing issue? Is it a centrist issue? Is it an issue that impacts everyone? In your mind, I mean, obviously it does, but a lot of people don't perceive it that way.
Sure.
Certainly, younger people obviously recognise that this is one of the most, globally, this is one of the most important things that's going to confront us. But older generations are like, well, I don't think that's going to be a problem for us until maybe my grandchildren.
Yeah.
What's the perception amongst the voting population from your research?
Well, it's one of the things that I think is most acutely different between back home and here is the nature of the political debate around climate and the environment has shifted in the United States in a fairly significant way. It's not as much of a partisan divide between climate believers and climate deniers. That the time for that conversation has really passed, even amongst those that perhaps were looking for a political wedge within climate once upon a time. It's about the access points to the conversation now, and they come from all sorts of different ways. So, on the conservative side, people will talk about climate within the context of investments, and they'll talk about it in the impact on premiums for insurance policies down in Miami and other parts of Florida. They might talk about it from the context of what it will mean for a number of military bases that are in areas that, frankly, may have serious issues maintaining that base as the climate shifts and as we have more direct consequences environmentally for those places. So I think politically it's moved from this very clear dichotomy between pro and anti into you can view climate from a bunch of different perspectives, and it's understandable and accessible to marry up your politics, whatever they may be, with believing there needs to be substantive action on climate.
It's a question I have for you later on the podcast, but I'm going to jump to it now, which is having now lived in the United States and working in this environment, and seeing how in Australian politics, both Labor and Liberal be unable to navigate this issue, and it's knocked over prime ministers on both sides of the political divide. And again, it was a problem for Labor at the last federal election, and this geographical divide between Queensland and the southern states, and climate and jobs and all that kind of stuff. With the things that you're doing over here in the United States, if you could go back to Australia, would you change the way that you engage with the electorate on the issue of climate and the environment broadly?
It's a really tough one, particularly for the Labor side of politics, and that is because there are constituencies within the Labor Party that have very different perspectives on what's important here and what components of the debate are vital. But to answer your question, I wouldn't necessarily change my attitude to how I engage with that issue. And I think that is because I've seen this from multiple different perspectives. As I alluded to at the beginning of the podcast, I come from a family of blue-collar workers who've grown up in Newcastle, multi-generationally, and they accept and understand that there is a shift to the types of work that they have done and will do in the future. But what progressive politicians of all stripes need to understand is you can't talk down to these people. And if you do that, they're smart enough to dismiss you. They've been, people across Australia and across the world have been talked at by politicians for time immemorial. On this issue, the lived experience is as valid whether you're sitting in the ivory tower of Parliament House or you're sitting on the streets of Maitland dealing with whether it's this week bushfires or could be next week floods or the week after, cyclones and hurricanes up in the north of the country. So I think it's really about the level of engagement and trust between the legislature and the electorate and how everyone's willing to lean into this issue together.
What I worry about is that particularly within the party, then broader than that into just broader Australian politics, is this argument between a green faction and a brown faction, and surely the answer lies somewhere in the middle. And I know it's easy to say things like, we should be trying to obviously move towards renewable energy sources and help people in like Newcastle transition into that kind of work. But as you said the other day when we had the session, not everyone can transition into a job. Some people's jobs just simply go, and it's not easy to train someone into a new role, maybe because of their age, maybe because of their qualifications, their education, all those kind of things. But this is more of a comment than anything. I want to get your thoughts on it as well. But what I worry about is seeing these two green and brown factions just beat each other up and not recognise that surely the answer is somewhere in the middle. Do you think there is, I guess my question would be, do you think there is an intellectual rigour within Australian politics to find those answers?
I'm hopeful there is, and I think there's a bunch of good people in Australian politics that are as devoted to understanding not only the political reality of this, but the effect it will have on the population. I worked in politics back home for 15 years, and as much as politicians get a bad rap, I didn't meet really anyone, with a few exceptions I won't name on both sides, that weren't devoted to really getting to the nub of how to fix these social challenges. Yeah. So, I give those that have been wrestling with this for a significant period of time the benefit of the doubt that they're seeing this through a policy lens more than they're seeing it through a political lens. But what I would say is that to some extent we've created this false dispute between the green faction and the brown faction, whatever you want to call it, between jobs and greening the economy and all these things. The reality is that these shifts happen over significant periods of time, and right or wrong, it doesn't matter how much of a dyed-in-the-wool, blue-collar, steel worker, coal miner you are, your skill set has been shifting for a long time now. The skills of a coal miner in Newcastle now are very different to what they were 20 years ago and 20 years before that. And what we've got to recognise is that a significant portion of those skills are useful in different vocations, and they will continue to evolve over time. My little brother went to school for about 10 years less than me, and for most of my life he's been earning more than me, because he services mining equipment as a fitter and turner up in Newcastle, and he lived through the boom years. But he is a highly skilled worker, and he has devoted his life to understanding a set of evolving skills that he's going to need to survive in a transitioning industry. And politicians, I think, are increasingly understanding that the best source of information on skill transformation is the workers themselves. And talking to them about how they are addressing that skill transformation in their own jobs and thinking about what that means for the next layer of jobs that we might not see yet. There's a great stat, trying to recall it on the top of my head now. There's a London School of Economics study that talked about the proportion of jobs in the United States that wouldn't be classified as green jobs, but that are traditional jobs or brown jobs or whatever you want to call them, that have skills that could be transferable to the green economy. And that proportion was 45% of the US workforce. Now, no one's out there saying that 45% of the US workforce now works in the green economy. It's a far lower number than that. But you can see an evolution of those workers moving into new and different areas over time without being told that they're being forced into a transition, rather being given the opportunity to do new and interesting things. We just got to work with people rather than telling them that the world is ending and it's their fault, because it's not. No one should be blamed for having a job for the last 30 years that puts food on their family's table that happens to be in an industry that has had a negative impact on the environment. It's all of our responsibility to manage that transition.
Share with us a couple of the ingenious speaking about intellectual rigor, ideas that the EDF are coming up with at the moment, particularly in data, and I said before in the sphere of in data space, and I deliberately say data and space collectively and separately because I'm fascinated by some of the work you guys are doing in that particular area. Do you want to share with us some of the things that EDF are working on right now?
Yeah, it's a very exciting project. It's called Methane Sat. And what we are doing at the very basic level, because as I've indicated multiple times, I'm not a scientist here, and to anyone from EDF that does listen to this podcast, particularly from our science team, I'm probably going to misrepresent a fact or two here. But on the top level, this is an incredibly exciting project because what we're doing is we are launching a satellite to measure methane emissions. And for those that don't know, methane is a far more potent greenhouse gas than carbon. Carbon obviously gets a pretty bad rap politically, and it is something we've seriously got to address to manage a decarbonised economy, obviously. But methane is a pretty bad guy as well. And there's a lot of different sources of methane, but one of the most acute is oil and gas fields, and in particular leakages from the production facilities in oil and gas fields. So it's also an invisible gas. So it's really, really hard to minimise or address or roll back what you can't see and measure. And of course, at the moment, the easiest way to measure it is to ask the companies themselves. And we work with all sorts of different companies on trying to measure and then make commitments around reducing methane. But as Ronald Reagan said, I think it was, trust but verify. So what EDF is doing is we're taking their commitments on face value, but we're going to launch a satellite that orbits around the world and sits above some of these different facilities and just makes sure that the levels of methane they're emitting are what they claim they are. And then rather than utilise this data in some secret lockable cabinet somewhere, we're going to make it publicly available. It's going to be accessible to researchers, to you and I, in an understandable and accessible format so that the oversight for reducing these emissions is not necessarily governments or policy institutions, it's public pressure. Because we think that when these companies make these commitments to greening their supply chains and their processes, that they should live up to those.
What kind of response have you had thus far from companies to launching
Methane Sat.
Methane Sat.
Methane Sat. Yeah, they're anticipating is probably the polite way to put it. But we have seen identifiable actions because when you know something like this is about to be flying around in the orbit and you know that it's going to produce these types of report outs, then you inevitably want to be seen as a good social actor ahead of time. So we have seen quantifiable reductions even before the thing's launched, but we're pretty confident that will escalate once methane sets up in the air.
When is it due to be launched?
It's 2021, and again, it's philanthropically supported. We've got a number of partnerships, including with the New Zealand government, which was announced only last week to provide all sorts of support around our launch operations. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of people that are invested in making sure this data is out there and publicly available, and I know this is an Australasian podcast, so can't quite give a shout out to anyone back home, but just across the ditch, Jacinda Ardern's government is demonstrating again that they're living up to what they say on climate and environmental regulation.
Outside of the United States, the EDF obviously has, you mentioned before, offices in London and Beijing and Tokyo. Talk us about the strategy behind putting your eyes and ears into those sectors and why.
Again, it's about where we can have the most impact and where we can add value. So, for example, our EU operation is based out of London at the moment, but we also have various other consultants and staff that are based in other parts of Europe. In Asia, our biggest presence is in China, and that's for a number of reasons. One of our stellar achievements is working with the national government in China to build out the emissions trading scheme that will come online soon, and there are a number of other things that we've been able to add our scientific and economic rigour to make better in these locations. And that's really the lens that we put across where we go and what kind of work we do, is there's a lot of people in the world that are devoted to the issues that we're talking about. We're not going to crowd the field by being there for the sake of it. We're going to make sure that the particular blend of expertise and skill we have adds value to the problem, and that's what we've found in places like China and Japan.
What's the perception of Australia within the United States in terms of its attitude towards tackling climate?
It's not a stellar reputation at the moment. It's within these circles, it's when people hear my accent, it's the second thing after some kind of bad impression of Steve Irwin. The second thing is usually admonition of our performance on climate over the last 5 years in particular. There's a consciousness right now, as much of the eastern seaboard burns, of the debate going on back home, or the lack of a debate, should I say, around the impact of climate on these catastrophic bushfires. And people are genuinely perplexed as to why we haven't grappled with the debate, let alone dealt with a level of action that comes after that. I don't agree with a lot, as you probably know, Stephen, with what the Greens Party has done politically in Australia, or I don't agree with a lot of the Greens Party in full stop, to be honest with you, which even as an environmentalist. But how they are currently admonishing political leaders on both sides of the aisle that this is not an opportune time to have a conversation around climate, a respectful conversation within the construct of the fact that there is our most acute focus should be on protecting life and property, but Australians are capable of walking and chewing gum at the same time. We can have 5 stories at the top of the Channel 9 news bulletin that report on the heroic actions of firefighters and still simultaneously talk about the fact that these unprecedented fires are the consequence of man-made climate change. They are made worse because of the impact that humans are having on the climate. And I don't think that Australians are incapable of holding those two facts in their head at the same time.
Is there any level of interest from EDF to weigh into our neck of the woods on issues such as climate change?
There's very strong interest from my mother in setting up an office in Sydney to get me home. But outside of that, we've got our hands full with the United States and China and Europe. And again, there's some great organisations in Australia who are working on some of these issues that we wholeheartedly support what the work that they're doing. But watch this space if I can ever find a way to get EDF back home.
Shout out to actually Lean, an organisation built in within the Labor Party, and I think actually they may now, certainly in the Victorian branch, I think they may have affiliate status. But those guys just plug away sometimes I just feel like the party cedes the environment to the Greens too much. And I think it's something that we seriously have to address going forward. And Lean are a voice within the party and a voice outside the party. Whenever certainly from a Victorian standpoint, we tend to have a lot of election battles with Greens and inner city seats, and lean into those conversations. They're the first to run phone banks and go down there and knock on doors and talk to voters about why the Labor Party's policies are better than the Greens.
Yeah,
they're tough. They're really tough conversations. They
are, and they've been tough for a long time. And credit to the various people from Lean. They've been doing this for a long time. Well before I was doing what I'm doing now, I have clear memories of Lean activists inside the various branches of the New South Wales Labor Party that I came through, and the ACT Labor Party, pushing the barrel on these issues when they were unpopular issues, when no one wanted to talk about them, when even inside the Labor Party we saw it as a distraction from the core issues that we were purporting to represent, and they were pushing this issue to their credit. I was a little bit more obsessed with kind of the machinations of politics, but also the economic issues that we talked about earlier. But they understood and anticipated the importance of this issue a long time before a lot of others in the Labor Party. Yeah, me included. Yeah. Final couple of questions. Do you get a chance to follow Australian politics much whilst you're in this demanding job? I'm pretty confident I'm the only person in the American political space and NGO space that has read the review into the 2019 election. I was going to ask you. I was meant to say to you before the show. Have you read the review? Probably gives you some demonstration that I try and keep one eye on what's going on back home. I've got a lot of close friends that are still heavily involved in the Labor Party on both state and federal level. So I keep one eye. I probably hear through their lens more than I may otherwise have heard. But do you want to give a hot take on the review? Can you sum up in 5 points? I've probably read out 35% of it. I'm not all the way through. Yeah, it's it's accessible reading in a way. It's actually, it kind of boils down the issues in a way that, credit to Emo and the rest of the team that put that together.
Jay Weatherall's the other guy.
Jay, of course, yes, and I know Linda Ashalem, who was involved, and there was a couple of others, but not just them. To Paul Erickson, that's obviously taken over the party now, and to be fair to Albo and his show as well, because it's the most frank and fearless review of a major political campaign that's gone on in Australia and has then ended up in the inbox of every journalist and every observer.
Yeah.
That's unprecedented. And that's not just because of the incredible disappointment we all felt the day after the election. The Libs have gone through some pretty horrendous election results, and they've never gone out and done a review and then given it to everybody. We have obviously decided that shining a light on what went wrong is important to make sure that we get it right next time. There's areas I'm not going to pass comment on what's right and wrong. It's not for me to do from the other side of the world. But I will say that I think the campaign team and Bill's team that toiled without much fanfare for 6 years up against all sorts of challenges that were thrown at them from outside, from inside, from everywhere else, and managed to overcome those obstacles and exceed the expectations that were unfairly set by a lot of people, deserve a lot of credit for that. They were really capable people. I think Bill's still got a lot to add to the national conversation. I think, someone like Ryan Liddell is a first-class political operator, and I hope he's sitting on a beach with a drink with an umbrella in it somewhere right now, but I also hope that he finds a way back in to help us because, people of that level of capability need to put their shoulder to the wheel if we're going to fix this, and the review's a good start.
Well said. Last question. I would ask you a question about rugby league, but I know nothing about rugby league. And I know that you're a passionate Newcastle fan, but I just would be out of my depth. So given that we are in New York, have you picked some teams in US sports to get behind since you've moved over here?
I have, and I'll tell you, I spent the first year and a half after I left politics while I was trying to figure out what I did with my life. I took a job at Fox Sports, and that's because, honestly, it's not just rugby league. I would pay $50 to watch two cockroaches crawl up a wall. That's how obsessed I am with sports. So there's an adage over here that if you're a true New Yorker, you follow the Nets, Jets, Mets. Because the Giants and the Yankees and all these other fancy teams are predominantly the teams of the tourists.
Yeah.
So, in terms of going along to games, I'm following the Nets, Jets, Mets logo.
Good.
Or slogan.
Hear that, Tom Cargill?
I'm well and truly on the Ben Simmons bandwagon down in Philadelphia as well. So it's a couple of hour train ride down there. So you go down and they've even been selling meat pies at the stadium. That's how keen they are to get the Aussies in there. So, yeah,
is that true?
They are. Yeah, the Sixers are really embracing the Aussie spirit.
That is brilliant. Is Brett Brown their coach?
He is, yeah.
He was a former coach of the Boomers and the North Melbourne Giants.
And there's a couple of Aussies. Ben Simmons obviously gets all the attention, but Jonah Bolden's on their team as well. So, yeah, there's a few Aussies floating around. The Jets actually have an Aussie kicker, Lachlan. There's a few Aussies floating around.
Very good. Thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedule to talk to us today. We really appreciate it. We wish you the best of luck here in the United States. Keep flying the Aussie flag proudly, but also keep flying the Social Democratic flag of the Labor Party proudly in the United States as well. We wish you the best of luck going forward.
Absolutely.